So who says trees and power lines can't get along? Of course, you got to watch out for those trees. Now actually, this isn't as bad for the tree as it looks, and I guess it kind of makes a point, even though I didn't really mean to here, but as long as good pruning cuts were made, a fairly small proportion of the crown is removed, it doesn't weaken the tree much like it looks like it might, and the tree will adapt to the change in distribution of weight fairly quickly and will do just fine. Looks bad, but isn't all that bad for the tree. So I'm speaking today about what people and trees think and how they react to utility tree pruning. Now first, I want to go a little bit over directional pruning. Directional pruning, this will be a reminder for most of you, I'm sure, but directional pruning is using good natural target cuts where you're not cutting stubs and you're not cutting flush cuts, using the branch bark ridge and the branch collar on the tree as your targets for pruning, and pruning off portions of a crown that head in directions that you can't have them heading, like towards power lines, and leaving the portions of a crown that head away from something like a power line or a house or over a street or what have you. And directional pruning like this, like we see here with this row of hackberries under these utility lines, can maintain trees and streets like this. There's a row of utility poles and electric utility lines over on the left over the top of these trees, and you barely know they're there. And it even allows for the planting of large maturing trees under power lines, like in this case where some hackberries were removed under a power line by a city-owned utility. The city and the utility decided it was important to retain the look and feel of the large hackberry canopy, so they replaced the trees that had been removed with, once again, large maturing hackberries. And the box in the inset shows a view that we'll see in the next slide. In this slide you can see just a close-up of what you saw in the previous slide. And these trees will be maintained through directional pruning to keep the lines clear. And this view shows 12 years later, after the previous view, that same shot where the trees have grown up now and they are starting to need beginnings of directional pruning. But they're going to be in great shape as long as the pruning's done promptly and well, because as long as they're directionally pruned from an early age, they'll never have been topped and they'll be in good shape. And the street tree canopy will be maintained. There are issues with directional pruning though, of course, and the issues can be summarized as being tree issues, and I'll explore those just a little bit, and then people issues. And the people issues tend to focus on aesthetics with the look you see here in both of these pictures, V's and L's and kind of odd-shaped trees you end up with, and then certain other perceptions about the trees and the practice and the people who do the practice that we'll go over in more detail. So first, the tree issues. What do trees think about directional pruning, if you want to call it that, or how do they react to directional pruning? Well, we'll cover each of these, summarizing kind of the major categories of how trees react to directional pruning. Involves wounds and wound healing or sealing, loss of foliage and food reserves, sprouting, Sunscald injury, balance, and directional pruning in previously topped trees. So we'll go over each of these. First, wounds and wound healing or sealing. When you prune, you make wounds on trees. It's unavoidable. It's what you're doing. Now you're trying to minimize the effects of these wounds, but nevertheless you're wounding the tree. And wounds, for the tree to react to them and either heal or seal the wound that's been made, takes energy, takes time and energy. Wounds also allow for decay to enter the tree, and some trees are pretty good at walling off that decay and protecting themselves. Nevertheless, that also takes energy, and so a tree has to react to that. Of course, directional pruning, as opposed to topping that it replaced in many cases for pruning under utility lines, is much less damaging than topping. So overall, directional pruning is still going to be better than topping, even though you are wounding the tree. And of course, that wounding, the effect of that wounding is minimized if you use natural target pruning. Loss of foliage and food reserves. When you prune a tree, whether you're topping or directionally pruning, you're removing some foliage, which has the ability to make food, but you're also removing woody tissue and foliage that has food reserves in it, usually stored as starch. It's unavoidable. The tree is losing some of its food-making capability and stored food. It's worse with what we might call catch-up pruning rather than with regular maintenance type pruning. So if you're getting a tree into the shape you want it in directional pruning and pruning fairly severely, then the tree is losing a lot more of its food making and storing capability all at once than it is if it's a tree that's been directionally pruned and you're just maintaining the clearance. This would affect on the edge trees more, and by that I mean trees that are kind of near the edge of life, that are weak for some reason, that are old. Young trees you could prune much more heavily and they'll more vigorously react to it. Again, directional pruning removes less of this material than topping and therefore is less drastic in its effects on the tree. And keep in mind that ANSI A300 standards recommend removal of no more than about 25% of the foliage of a tree in any 1 year. So even in directional pruning, we can ease the effect by getting a tree into the shape we want over a couple of cycles if it's going to be too drastic for it all at once. When you directionally prune and when you top, you get sprouting. Pruning stimulates sprouting and sprout growth because you're removing a source of auxin from the shoots above where you've pruned, and you're going to get some sprouting. Temporarily, sprout growth makes the tree's food situation worse because those tissues at first aren't productive until leaves are formed, and then those leaves mature. They are a net drain on the tree's energy reserves, but eventually they come into production and then they're a net gain for energy. Directional pruning with natural target pruning, again, minimizes sprouting compared to topping because you're not making heading cuts, you're making thinning cuts where the effects of loss of auxin are moderated by the auxin coming from the shoots you've left. So again, directional pruning is better than topping. And leaving slower growing sprouts when you do directional pruning can actually reduce resprouting that might happen under directional pruning and can soften the appearance. Sunscald injury is something you see sometimes with directional pruning, also of course with topping. I don't like the term, but basically it's damage to tissues that are exposed by the pruning. You're exposing them to sunlight they may not have been exposed to in a long time. And it's unclear exactly what the mechanism might be. It might be winter injury, opening up of these tissues to light and warming from the sun in the winter that might then cause wounds to form when these warmed up tissues get frozen at night or on colder days. It's likely on species that show winter trunk injury anyway, and one of the species that seems to show this both with directional pruning but also just when the stems open up to sunlight just due to regular pruning is Norway maple. That's one we see it a lot on in Utah, but it can happen with other species too. And again, leaving interior foliage can help maybe suppress sprouts that aren't likely to break free and grow fast, and yet can be there to help shade some of that tissue. Being a little less drastic can reduce the effect somewhat. Now, balance is the change in the distribution of weight of the tree is something that seems to concern people quite a bit with directional pruning because you do get some pretty odd shapes and odd changes in the distribution of the mass of the tree. And it's true that pruning changes the center of gravity of a tree, but it also reduces weight, which means less stress, not more. It's only really a problem if the soundness of the junctions of heavy limbs, where these junctions are that are having different stresses put upon them, where they're located, if those junctions are unsound, then you may be a little more likely to get some breakage, especially soon after the pruning has occurred. And also root system soundness would also be important, especially when you do one-sided pruning of a tree. But eventually, assuming the tree is sound enough to hold for a while, then the tree will compensate by production of reaction wood. It takes time, but it can do it and will. And so we'll show what this change in balance looks like. Now the center of gravity of this tree is about here, a little right of center. That'd be about where half of the mass of the tree is on each side of this line we see. Now each of these two large limbs that we see, or codominant trunks that we see coming from the main trunk, each has its own center of gravity, and these lines show maybe about where those centers of gravity might be, again with equal weight distributed on either side of the line for each of these major codominant trunks. Now if we take out the middle of this tree like we might in good directional pruning, this is pretty drastic because nothing was left on the inside. Then we do indeed move the center of gravity, not so much of the tree really wouldn't change much in this because equal amounts of weight are removed from both sides approximately, but the center of gravity of each of these limbs moves outward, and that's because we've removed the limbs on the inside and therefore shifted the weight out, and that does put stress on the tree, on those limbs, and creates a greater force pulling out. However, one way to soften that, both in appearance but also in the distribution of weight, is to leave a little bit of that interior foliage and wood. It doesn't have to be a lot, just some, and moves that center of gravity for each of those codominant trunks back in a little bit. Also helps with visuals and may help with possibilities of sunscald and sprouting. Okay, one-sided trees, one-sided pruning, like this is the same tree, but say the electric lines were off to the side, to the right here. Well, the right-handed limb likely would need to be removed because it would have been hard to achieve adequate clearance with any pruning cut on that right-sided codominant trunk short of cutting the whole thing off. So we cut the whole thing off, and what was the center of gravity of the tree in this case does indeed shift to the left pretty drastically, and then pulls out to the left because of that, pulls in that direction more than it would have otherwise. Again, if you can leave some material, which admittedly is a compromise for keeping the lines clear, you both help with the visual aspects of this tree and the pruning you've done on it, make it a little more acceptable, a little less likely to have sprouting, less likely to have problems with decay with that much larger pruning wound you would need to have made down where the codominant trunks diverge from one another. Now you can make much smaller pruning cuts. So overall there's a lot of reason to try to keep wood and foliage if you can and still maintain adequate clearance. And you can see you shifted the center of gravity of that tree back towards the middle again, so you're making it a little less drastic in terms of weight distribution change as well. These are the places to really pay attention to when you're doing these kinds of more drastic pruning, directional pruning. On the left we see where the codominant trunks attach to one another, especially in the V, but also on either side, a little bit up and down from the V, watching for signs of included bark and cracks from included bark, stress, and so on. But remember, you didn't create that V when you did the directional pruning, you just made it more visually apparent. You are changing the forces on these codominant trunks, pulling out in either direction more than they used to, but the tree will react to that over time with reaction wood, and it'll end up in pretty good shape. And with the one-sided tree here on the right, the places to watch are again in that V and up and down from where the V used to be a little bit, and then also where the root system attaches to the trunk and the large woody roots going out from that. If there were problems there, then you might have some immediate concern about the stability of this tree. If there aren't problems, then again the tree will react to this with reaction wood in both the root system and the trunk, and will be able to compensate for it in a few years. And of course, the way the tree reacts to those changes in its weight distribution and therefore changed forces trying to push it over essentially, or break off pieces, is by production of reaction wood. Reaction wood is simply the growth rings in a stem, whether it's a large woody root, the trunk, or a branch. The growth rings grow faster on one side of the branch than the other, and this varies by the species of tree. And you'll either have tension wood created, as is shown here. Tension wood is on the upside of a branch that's leaning or a trunk that's leaning, or you'll have compression wood on the downside of the lean. Either way, you get larger growth rings helping to either push the branch up, kind of hold it up, or helping to keep it from sagging down. And that reaction wood is due to a reaction to a change in weight distribution, and it doesn't take very long before you get enough wood added to help stabilize a tree that might be temporarily a little less stable than you'd like. Finally, in terms of how the tree reacts to directional pruning, we should talk just a little bit about directional pruning in previously topped trees, like we're seeing here with what looks like a London plane. This tree has been previously topped, and now some branches were allowed to grow out of the previous topping cut. And these multiple leaders you get coming out of topping cuts, you should ideally prune down to one or a few, and you should be concerned in doing this kind of pruning with watching for signs of failure of these branches where they attach to the old stubs from previous topping cuts, because those are prime spots for the entry of decay. With previous severe topping, you might really need to consider removal of the tree rather than trying to train it into a directional pruning type situation after topping. You also should be more concerned if it's a tree that's a poor decay compartmentalizer. Trees like that tend to show a lot of decay anyway, like willows and cottonwoods, for example, are much more likely to need to be removed after previous topping and not be amenable to correction into a directional pruning situation. Now on to the people issues, and this is the bulk of what I want to talk about here. I conducted a study last year called The Role of Education and Acceptability of Directional Pruning in Utility Line Clearance. It was funded by the Tree Fund, and the objectives were to find out what people know about tree pruning and care, what people know and think about utility tree pruning and directional pruning in particular, the effects of an educational brochure on people's knowledge and attitudes, and willingness to pay for burying lines. And we won't talk about all of that in detail today, but we'll talk about some of it. Briefly, talking about the methods I used, I conducted a mail survey of randomly selected households in 6 interior west cities. They happen to be the largest city in each of the 6 states in the interior west, 6 states which included Boise in Idaho, Salt Lake City in Utah, Phoenix in Arizona, Albuquerque, New Mexico, Denver, Colorado, and Cheyenne, Wyoming. And in each case except one, these were investor-owned utilities. The Salt River Project in Phoenix is a publicly owned utility. All were Treeline USA utilities, so they reached the highest level of honors, you might say, for doing utility tree pruning right and treating trees around utilities right. All the cities are Tree City USAs, so the cities do urban forestry right, and so they should be in pretty good shape. And as I said, all were the largest cities in their states. The survey was conducted early in 2004 using a method where there was a mailing, a reminder postcard, and a repeat mailing to try to get as high a return as possible. And we had 2,100 mailed and eventually 384 returned. So we still didn't get quite the response rate we would have liked. It was 21%. So to check to see what the effects of non-response bias might be, we called 10% of the non-respondents to identify characteristics they had versus characteristics of those who responded. And there were some minor differences that were interesting nonetheless. We won't go into that further here today. The survey included a 9-page booklet with an introductory letter, and there were 3 sections on tree care practices and issues, utility pruning and trimming, and directional pruning, and then some background information and demographics we collected. Half of the people we mailed to received a brochure, and half did not receive a brochure. Now, the brochure was called Trees and Power Lines, put out by USU Extension. No utility company was identified on it. And if they got one, they were asked to read it first. It explained things like tree and power line conflicts, problems with topping, directional pruning concepts and appearance and why it might be used rather than topping, and then talked about tree removal and replacement that sometimes is needed. And there were some diagrams as shown here that were included to try to, in a kind of idealized fashion, describe what a topped tree like the one here on the left might look like versus several different appearances of directionally pruned trees. So on to results. We'll look at if people care. Mostly we'll focus on what people know and feel about utility pruning, and then the effects of that educational brochure on what they feel they know. Briefly, just in determining whether people care, yes, we found that people think highly of urban trees and their health and welfare. They were asked that question, and as has been shown in many other studies, people indeed do think highly of urban trees and the health and welfare of urban trees. However, 75% had thought a moderate amount or less about utility tree pruning. Now, that's not much. On the other hand, you can turn that around and say that 25% had thought quite a bit or a great deal about utility pruning, which actually maybe is more than I would have expected. Nevertheless, the 75% having thought a moderate amount or less could explain the relatively low response rate. It's just a subject that people haven't thought a lot about. Now on to what people know and feel about utility pruning. We asked people to indicate who prunes trees around utilities and why they prune them, and we won't look at that further here. To indicate their agreement with 16 statements about trees and utilities. Kind of a quiz, but we tried to keep it not feeling like a quiz by asking their agreement or disagreement with statements. Asked them to indicate their willingness to pay to bury lines, and asked them to rate the appearance of directionally pruned versus topped trees. On to those statements about trees and utilities and directional pruning. So first we're going to look at people's agreement with statements about harm to trees from utility pruning in their area. In each of these sets of bar charts we'll see for several slides, we have agreement on the vertical axis on the left, with 1 being strongly disagree and 4 being strongly agree. So halfway between 2 and 3 is neutral. And in each case there's an orange bar that shows their agreement if they did not receive a brochure, and a green bar that shows their agreement if they did receive that educational brochure. So for the statement that pruning harms tree health, here on the left, it's below the middle, so people tended to disagree that the utility pruning in their area harms tree health. And keep in mind, for the most part, these people should be seeing directional pruning rather than topping, because that's what their utility has as a standard if they are a Treeline USA utility. Okay, on to the middle one here, that the pruning they see harms tree aesthetics. People tend to agree that that pruning harms tree aesthetics. And in both of these, the brochure didn't have much effect, both the harms tree health and harms tree aesthetics. Then when they were asked whether techniques are used that minimize tree harm and maintain clearance, they tend to agree, with a little more agreement if they receive the brochure, but still not much different. Okay, on to some statements about the people who do the utility pruning and what they care about in their training. Again, we have agreement on the vertical axis here. And the ones with stars are where the brochure really seemed to have some effect. People tended to agree that these people care a lot about the public's safety, and they were more likely to agree if they received the brochure. People tended to disagree if they didn't receive a brochure, that the people doing the pruning care a lot about trees, and that was turned around and turned to at least slight agreement if they received the brochure. When given a statement that these people prune without concern for trees, again, that's the reverse of the previous one, they tend to think that if they didn't receive a brochure, that people prune without concern for trees. They tend to be somewhat in agreement with that, and disagreement if they received a brochure. So they're more positive about the people doing the pruning if they receive the brochure in all these. And then there's very strong agreement, both with and without a brochure, that these people care a lot about line clearance and outages, that the people doing the pruning care a lot about line clearance and outages, which seems obvious. There's fairly strong agreement without a brochure that these people doing the pruning are highly trained professionals, and that agreement level is increased if they received a brochure, and actually is quite high if they received a brochure. A couple of further statements about the people who do utility pruning in terms of public relations and trust. There's pretty strong disagreement that these people doing the pruning do a good job explaining pruning to the public. Little effect of the brochure on that. So they tend not to think that utility tree pruning people are doing a good job explaining what they're doing. On the other hand, it appears that interactions with these people, those who have had interactions with them, have had fairly satisfactory interactions. There's agreement with that statement. And then whether they trust the people doing the pruning to treat trees properly, there's general agreement with that, with a little bit of increased agreement if they received a brochure. Now, if there were a few statements about burying lines and also use of small trees instead of big trees under lines. First, here on the left, we see the statement, utility lines should be moved underground. There's pretty strong agreement with that. However, if people were asked, are you willing to pay significantly higher rates for burying the lines, or a statement was made that they are willing to pay significantly higher rates for burying lines, there was strong disagreement with that statement. So people would like to have the lines moved underground. They don't want to have higher rates for having that done. And generally there was disagreement that it's okay to replace large trees with small trees under lines, that would be a good fix. There's a little more agreement with it if people receive the brochure. Nevertheless, in both cases, with and without a brochure, they tend to disagree that small trees should replace the large trees that are under the lines, which gets at one of the arguments you hear, right tree in the right place, let's put small trees under power lines, small maturing trees, so we don't have to prune the trees, and it looks like that's maybe not going to be completely acceptable to a number of people. Now let's look at agreement with a few of these trust and care statements by how much thought the respondent had put into utility pruning previous to receiving this survey. And you can see the amount of thought, the scale shown here on the right, with no thought being the kind of orange bar, through very little thought, moderate, quite a bit, and finally the dark gray bar, a great deal of thought had been put into utility pruning in their life. So those are the people who had some occasion to really think about utility pruning, even though fairly few had. And we again have the agreement scale on the vertical axis from 1 to 4, strongly disagree, to the top, strongly agree. So when we look at the statement, the people doing the pruning care a lot about my safety, there was fairly strong agreement with that for those who had not thought much about utility pruning in the past, and that agreement dropped to slight disagreement, a little below the middle, for those who had thought a great deal about utility pruning. So the more they've thought about utility pruning, the less likely they are to think that the utility tree pruners care about their safety. That pattern is reversed for the statement that the pruning is done without concern for the trees, the bars in the middle here, and we see that there's pretty strong disagreement, if people hadn't thought much about pruning, that the pruning is done without concern for trees, but that agreement increases to fairly strong agreement if the people had thought a lot about trees, the dark gray bar. So what we're seeing there is they're less likely to think that the utility pruners prune with concern for trees if they've thought a lot about utility pruning. If they've thought a lot about utility pruning, they have a more negative view of the pruner's concern for the trees. And that's also played out in the right-hand set of bars, where there's strong agreement that they trust the pruners to treat trees properly if they haven't thought much about utility pruning, and that agreement drops off sharply to where if they've thought a great deal about utility pruning in their lives, then they have a lack of trust of the people pruning to treat trees properly. So in all three cases, the more people have thought about utility pruning, the less trusting they are, the less good they feel about the people doing the work. And you can imagine these people putting a great deal of thought into utility pruning probably have thought about it because of some negative reaction they've had or negative experience. Something to think about. So, in summary, in terms of the tree and utility statements, people feel that utility pruning doesn't harm tree health but does harm aesthetics, that utility pruners care most about keeping lines clear, but that companies don't do a good job explaining what they're doing to the public, and there's some disagreement that large trees should be removed and replaced with small maturing trees under the lines. Those who've thought a lot about utility pruning are less trusting, and the brochure tended to increase trust and greatly increased agreement that the pruners are highly trained professionals. Then people were asked to indicate their willingness to pay to bury lines. So we actually got specific about burying lines and asked the question, how much more would you be willing to pay for burying utility lines so that trees won't have to be pruned for line clearance? And we show this here with and without the brochure, and the bars indicate the percent giving a certain answer. So with and without the brochure, most people, almost half, were not willing to pay any increase in their rates, utility electric rates, to have lines buried. But still, that means that over half were willing to pay some amount more, most of those being 1 to 2% or 3 to 5%. But there were even some, almost, say 8%, who were willing to pay 5 to 10% more, and a few percent willing to pay greater than 10% more. So there is significant, at least as indicated by this survey, a willingness to pay some more money to have utility lines buried to avoid pruning the trees. And the brochure tended to increase that willingness to pay a little bit. Now, if we look at answers to that same question by how much the respondent trusts the people who do utility line pruning to treat trees properly, with strong distrust being the left-hand bar, the orange bar, and strong trust being the green bar, we see that especially when we look under the no increase set of bars here, on the left, that if the person answering the survey trusts the people who do the pruning to treat trees right when they're pruning, then they're much less likely to be willing to pay anything to bury the lines, which is an interesting result. What it means is if they trust the people doing the pruning, they're not going to be out there pushing to have lines buried. And often line burial is a practical nightmare, especially in older neighborhoods. So if the pruners, if the utilities want to avoid burying a lot of lines, one of the best ways is going to be to engender trust in the people that are evaluating their actions. So in summary, in terms of burial of lines, people tend to want lines moved underground. About half are willing to pay higher rates, but they're less willing if trust is greater, or you could also look on it as they're less likely to want to push for that if their trust is greater. And the brochure made them more likely to be willing to pay a small amount for burial. Then they were asked to rate the appearance of directionally pruned versus topped trees. We get a lot of negative responses, I had noticed through my professional career, to the look of directional pruning, especially when you don't have a row of trees kind of hiding the look, one tree hiding the look of the next tree, and you get these drastic V's like shown in B here, and L's like you see in C, or the worst, it tends to seem the most drastic, is what you see in D, the one-sided trees. And I had wondered, do people tend to look at least an ideally appearing topped tree as being better looking than the V's or the L's or the one-sided? So I asked them, do they prefer the look of A or B, which is best for the tree, A or B, which is best for line clearance, A or B, and then finally, do they prefer the look of C, the L, or D, the one-sided? And again, we have with and without brochure for each of these sets of bars, with percent responding being the vertical scale. So they were to rate which is best for the looks of the tree, and they preferred A over B, with that preference switching a little if they received the brochure, although they still preferred the look of that kind of idealized topped tree, A, over the V of B, but more of them started to prefer the V if they had been educated a little. It was even easier to convince them that B was better for the tree than A if they received the brochure. Actually went from, without the brochure, people still strongly thinking that A was better for the tree than B, but that reversed slightly when they received the brochure, and more were convinced that B was better than A, which is great. So it was clear to all of them that B was better for clearance than A, and again, there was a strengthening effect in that opinion if they received the brochure. And then whether C or D was better in looks, in both cases with or without a brochure, they prefer the look of C over D. If they read the brochure, they would know that probably C and D are okay for the tree, that either one is okay, but they don't like the looks of D compared to C. When asked to rate which of the four looks worst, it went from A, B and C being fairly equal, and then D being by far the one they think looks the worst. And the brochure helped draw down the number of people thinking that D was the worst. Nevertheless, it's still quite a high percentage. They don't like the more drastic appearance of the one-sided. So in summary, in terms of appearance, people like the look of topping. Granted, it's that idealized topped tree. I could have easily picked a diagram or a picture that looked much gnarlier and less good, and probably have brought down the acceptability of the look of topping. However, I think people who are for topping tend to think, well, yeah, you have to have that drastic look when it's first topped, but then it softens up and looks just like a hedge. That's my guess. People don't like the look of directional pruning, and they think it's bad for the tree. The L's and one-sides were worse than the V's, and the brochure made them rate directional pruning appearance higher and topping lower. But still, 1/3 think directional pruning looks good, where 2/3 don't think it looks good. And that's a problem. A few other results want to look at the effect or possible effect of these recognition programs, Treeline USA and Tree City USA. Treeline USA is a program where the National Arbor Day Foundation recognizes utilities that do a good job and demonstrate good practices that protect and enhance urban forests. And then Tree City USA is recognition by the National Arbor Day Foundation for cities that have active quality urban community forestry programs. So I asked people, are you familiar with Treeline USA or Tree City USA? Treeline is the orange bar, Tree City is the green bar, and this is the percent responding with a particular answer. And over 90% said they had definitely never heard of Treeline USA. Tree City USA has been around longer, the green bar here on the left, and we see that over 70% definitely had never heard of Tree City USA. So if you look at the set of bars on the right, definitely heard of and know what it is, almost none had definitely heard of Treeline USA and knew what it was, maybe 1 or 2%, and only a few percent definitely heard of and knew what Tree City USA was. So it seems likely that these programs, if the programs are to promote what the utility does in care for trees and promote what the city does in care for trees with the citizens, then the programs probably aren't reaching their potential. So what's the effect of that educational brochure we put in? A very simple brochure, very short, 2 8.5 by 11 sides with fairly simple messages. Well, education needs to have two outcomes. People need to know more, but also if they are to take action on what they know, like approve or disapprove of something that the city is doing or the utility is doing, then they need to be sure of their knowledge. The less sure they are of their maybe newfound knowledge, then the more likely they are to not want to take action or not have a strong opinion. It takes both of these to get action and appropriate behavior. And what we found was that the brochure influenced attitudes and could help change behavior. We can't predict from what we measured whether behavior will be changed, but we can say that it influenced attitudes. And though we didn't show the data here, it also made people more sure of their knowledge. We asked them if they agreed, disagreed, or didn't know, and the didn't knows went down. If they had received the brochure, they were more likely to know, have a strong opinion one way or another. Why should we care? Why should a utility care? Well, I think it's worth trying to avoid situations like this. Situations where we all have seen times where pruning projects, pruning under utility lines, or even worse, removal projects, end up leading to major conflicts between citizens and between towns and the utility needing to keep lines clear. Electric utility wants to rip out 100-year-old trees in a power struggle, fighting mad. They have a fight on their hands. I think it's worth trying to avoid these kinds of situations. You should care to avoid these kinds of, this is a letter to the editor taken from a paper talking about destruction wrought by contract tree trimmers. They say they've been trained. The question is, trained in what? Do you think it's worth trying to convince people like this that you're a highly trained professional? I think so. I think it is. Grotesque, mutilation, do something. Here's another letter to the editor talking about horrible mutilations to formerly beautiful trees. Go get them. These kinds of sentiments make it hard to do the work that needs to be done. Public and customers care a lot when they get worked up. Now, we saw from the results of the survey that maybe not a lot of people have thought a lot about utility pruning, but it doesn't take a lot to get in the way of keeping lines clear and keeping trees healthy. We have work to do, and understanding people helps us do that work. I think it's possible that utility line clearance people can avoid being the bad guys, or at least avoid being such bad guys in people's eyes. And an analogy I would draw to the utility line clearance situation would be how foresters, professional foresters, maybe 30 years ago, when opposition to clear cutting and certain forms of timber harvest, especially on public lands, became more vocal and more pronounced, foresters became the bad guys because they knew what was right based on science and what's technically correct, and they said, hey, we're foresters, we're professionals, let us do our job. And they didn't listen enough to what the public wanted, especially on public lands where the public should have considerable say. And they were right, forestry-wise, that clear-cutting often was the right thing to do for certain species of trees and forests, but they were wrong in terms of what the public should be willing to accept. That's not the forester's business to determine, it's the public's business. Utility arborists can go the same way. They can stand on what's technically correct, they can stand on what's correct for safety's sake, or they can give some ground in some cases to get what they want in other cases. And often the utility forester ends up having to give ground because politically they try to do a removal project or a drastic pruning project in a very publicly sensitive area, maybe on a main street, maybe with some historic trees, and they end up getting backed down because of public sentiment, and they end up having to change what they're going to do anyway. So I think it's worth trying to understand what the public wants and recognize when you're in one of those situations so you can be the good guy from the start and possibly have less opposition to the pruning you need to do. The right tree in the right place won't always work. Right tree in the right place is talked about a lot when it comes to utility pruning, but the fact is you can't always get rid of all the large trees under power lines. And I think, given that you have directional pruning in your tool bag, you shouldn't always get rid of large trees under lines. It's possible to maintain large maturing trees and still have adequate line clearance. It's not as cheap as having small trees or no trees, but often it's what the community desires for certain places. And especially if you start from a young age with directional pruning, then it's much easier to keep a good healthy forest canopy near utilities. Directional pruning shouldn't always be the last tool you use. You shouldn't always go immediately to wanting to remove and then have directional pruning be the back off stance. Sometimes you should start with directional pruning. Here's an example of the right tree in the right place from a website where, in this case, the zone under the utility actually shows a no tree zone. No trees allowed there, and small trees that mature 25 or less feet in height have to be at least 25 feet from the lines, and a large tree, meaning a tree maturing over 40 feet in height, has to be at least 60 feet from overhead power lines. How many neighborhoods are there where you could have a large tree in the neighborhood, especially in the front yards, if the utilities are in the front yards, if you followed these kinds of examples or guidelines? You should care because utility foresters need social license to do their work. You may have the legal right to prune and remove trees, but you don't always have enough public acceptance to allow it or to allow for it without a lot of consternation and bad press. I think there are things that can be done, especially to increase the acceptance of directional pruning, and I think that education and outreach can work to some extent. It can improve people's perceptions of and acceptance of the actions of utility foresters. You may need to involve an impartial party. The brochure that I sent out was from an extension service, not from the utility, and that may have had some effect on the acceptability of its message. I think it's worth using posting and pre-notification with a simple brochure like that to let people know what's going to be going on with trees near where they live. And I gotta think, though it's not proven, that using the Treeline USA status that the utility has achieved to help improve public relations has to be worthwhile. Otherwise, why go to the effort? And I think it's important to counter incorrect notions about topping, like that it's not all that bad for trees, because if people think topping is okay, they're not going to accept more drastic looking directional pruning. They need to have explained to them how directional pruning is actually okay for the tree and topping is not. I also think it's important to do the work right and to train crews properly. I think it's important that crews look and act professional. Really, if you think about it, utility line clearance crews are the utility's face to the public for the most part. Other than receiving a monthly bill and occasionally hearing about rate increases, when else does the person hear from the power company? And especially have people out in their neighborhood working. Often it's either going to be linemen or it's going to be the utility line clearance crews. So having them act and look and speak professionally would be very important. And then I think it's important to allow for directional pruning as a reasonable option, not just tree removal and small tree planting. And finally, there's my contact information. Continue viewing if you'd like to see a good example of a video public service announcement developed by a utility that explains utility tree pruning. Here's a good example of a utility doing things right in terms of explaining to the public the pruning process, why trees are pruned, stressing science, professionalism, that the work is done by arborists, and that it's done with caring for the trees. And it doesn't gloss over the fact that this isn't necessarily all that good looking, but makes the point that it's okay for the tree. I think it's a great example. It was done by Utah Power, part of Pacific Corps, and has been used on television stations in Utah.